Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining me this morning. My name is Darby Fisher. I'm the workers' comp commercial underwriter here at CID Insurance, and today we're going to go over the highs and lows of final audits, more specifically, how to dispute a workers' comp final audit. Just a few things to go over, some webinar logistics. All participants are going to be defaulted to mute and able to hear but not speak. Go ahead, feel free to write any questions you have at any time in the chat room, and a short survey will appear at the end of the webinar. And as always, we do appreciate your feedback. So our webinar objectives today. So we are going to be identifying the reasons when to dispute a final audit, being able to determine what went wrong with the final audit results, understand what exactly is required to file a formal audit dispute with the carrier, and how to avoid audit disputes in the future, manage the insured's renewal terms so you're not ending up in that same cycle. So preparing your insured for their final audit. Before the end of the policy term, the insured is going to receive a notice directly from the carrier regarding their upcoming final audit. So the insured is going to receive an audit questionnaire listing the items needed in order to complete their final audit, along with a blank audit form for the insured to fill out. Those notices are going to be sent by mail from the carrier to the insured directly. So ensuring the insured's mailing address on file is correct is going to avoid a lot of miscommunication. As the broker, you can also request a copy from the carrier, or you can reach out to your wholesale broker to provide you with it. So as I mentioned, this request is going to detail all information needed to be provided to verify payroll and class codes, which we'll discuss a little bit in more depth throughout the webinar. So make sure to connect with your insured around this time, typically before the policy term is about to renew, to ensure that they've received the final audit request and also provided all of the requested information to the carrier. So gathering those certificates of insurance for potential vendors or subcontractors, payroll reports, tax returns, everything that the carrier has listed out. The insured typically has 30 days to comply with their final audit. If it's not completed within that allotted time frame, it will be marked as non-compliant. And carriers are extremely strict with their due dates, so they don't allow for extensions. For certain classes of business and or higher premium accounts, a phone or in-person interview may be required to verify the information submitted. So ensuring that the contact information on file is correct is going to be really important. So when you're binding that policy with the carrier, that very first policy term, that contact information that you put on file, that's the information the carrier is reaching out to for the insured. So before we move forward, we're all aware that final audits are required after the annual policy term. But even for policies that may cancel midterm for either non-payment or the insured replaces coverage or they sell their business, the policy for whatever duration it is active is still going to be required to complete a final audit. I see a lot of issues with that. For example, let's say an insured has an annual policy with AmTrust and it's a May 1st, 2024 effective date. And it cancels midterm because they don't pay their monthly bill. So we don't have a market any longer and the insured replaces coverage elsewhere. Even though they're no longer insured by AmTrust, they still had a policy in place, whether it be for a month, 2 months, 7 months, whenever that policy had canceled. So the insured is still going to be required to complete a final audit from their effective date of May 1st to the date of cancellation. I just wanted to touch on that quickly because we do have insureds who sometimes will replace coverage or their policy will cancel and they don't realize that they're still going to have an audit to comply with. So what happens once the audit documents are submitted to the carrier? So that way, after that, the insured's final audit is going to be assigned to an auditor. Based on the information provided, the auditor verifies that the actual payroll quoted at the beginning of the policy term reflects the actual payroll and scope of the work performed during the policy term. So this, in other words, this is going to ensure that the insured has paid the right amount during the policy term for the coverage they received. The auditor is going to be reviewing payroll, responding to the carrier. If they reach out for something more, is also really imperative to having the final audit completed. If the carrier does not hear back within the allotted time period, they're going to ask for additional information and possibly be marked as non-compliant. They're going to be reviewing payroll documentation such as W-2s, employee job duties, certificates of insurance. All of that information is going to be looked at that the insured has provided to the carrier. Once it's been reviewed, a copy is sent to the insured and a copy is also sent to the agent. So you receive the final audit, and this may result in several scenarios. The first is the risk exposure and the payroll match the policy estimate, resulting in no cost difference. The second, your risk exposure or payroll was lower than your policy estimate, so your premium for the policy is less than what was paid, potentially resulting in a refund to the insured. And the third is your risk or payroll was higher than what was paid. So the premium is actually going to be more than what was paid initially, resulting in owed premium to the carrier. So it's typical for premiums to fluctuate after the final audit. However, these reasons I indicated on the slide are reasons when potentially filing an audit dispute may be necessary. So before I get into these reasons why the insured may request to dispute the final audit, I do want to say that not every time will the dispute be accepted by the carrier. Yes, sometimes the auditor has made an error, and in those cases, the dispute is going to be accepted and the audit is revised, as long as the appropriate documentation is provided by the insured. On the flip side, though, additional premium may have been due from an error the insured made. And so I want to talk about also things to be aware of as you're managing the insured's policy from inception to their final audit. So as I go over some potential reasons why a dispute may occur, I'm going to provide both sides of the situation. So the first one, the audit payroll does not match what was reported. So let's say the submitted payroll documentation by the insured was around $100,000 and the auditor issues the final audit with payroll at $150,000. So, there's a $50,000 difference. This could be an indication that there may have been an auditor error and payroll was calculated incorrectly, or the insured hired an additional employee during the policy term and they didn't adjust the policy to reflect an increase in payroll and it was caught at audit. So in that case, you want to make sure you're checking in with the insured throughout the policy term for any changes to annual payroll. The second, the payroll is distributed differently by class code. So for example, you have a janitorial business with a commercial janitorial exposure and a residential janitorial exposure. So these are two different classes of business and the rates are very different. Residential janitorial is actually a higher rated class code. And so when the insured receives their final audit, instead of the payroll being split between the two classes of business, like how it was rated during the policy term, the final audit actually has all of the employee payroll in the residential class code, resulting in additional premium due. So this is an indication, a few things of what I know may be an indication is that the carrier may have asked for specifics on employee job duties, and that wasn't provided by the insured. Therefore, the auditor places all of the payroll into the higher rated class code, or the business exposure only services residential home, and the insured had the payroll split between residential and commercial. So you want to be able to confirm the exposure when you're servicing the account to ensure that they are being rated in the appropriate class of business. The third is the owner's payroll is included in the final audit. The final audit has a higher payroll amount than what was estimated at the beginning of the policy period. So let's say we have a business with 3 owners and the payroll increase on the final audit matches what one of the owners makes annually. So the carrier may have accidentally included an owner's payroll when there was an exclusion form on file, which is a reason to dispute. But on the flip side, an exclusion form for an officer may not have been submitted at the time of the bind. Therefore, the owner's payroll is automatically included in the audit. So as a broker, always ensure you're collecting signed exclusion forms for all owners of the business. And the last common mistake for a reason to dispute is subcontractors and vendors' payroll was included when a certificate of insurance was submitted to the carrier. So let's say we have an insured that it's a contractor that utilizes many subcontractors. So when the insured receives their final audit, they notice the payroll is much higher than what they reported. The carrier may have included vendors that did have certificates of insurance provided for. However, I come across this extremely often. Vendors and subcontractors get hired by a business without confirming and collecting a certificate of insurance from the vendor showing that they have their own workers' comp coverage within the policy period of the insured. So if the vendor or subcontractor does not have their own coverage within the policy period, they are going to be included in the final audit. So when the insured is looking to hire any subs or vendors, broker practice confirm with the insured that those vendors and subs have their own workers' comp coverage. Otherwise, the insured is going to be picking up the payroll for them at the time of audit. We do have a question in the chat is, how does one see what the insured submitted, especially if they are submitted directly to the carrier on a website or e-audit? So that's a good question. So if the insured is not providing you with the documentation directly and they're sending it straight to the carrier, you'll have to request that from the carrier and they will need the approval from the insured before they can release that to you. What I typically do and request for that my brokers do is I'll ask them to have the insured send the payroll documentation to them, which is then forwarded to us. So that way I'm the one receiving the payroll documentation submitted and I can send it over to the carrier. So I know that everything they're requesting has been received. If that's something that the insured, that you don't have the ability to do, then you can request that the carrier release that information to you as long as they have permission from the insured. So how to determine what went wrong? Requesting the audit worksheet. So if the insured believes there's an error with the final audit, it could be one of the things I mentioned in the previous slide. The first thing that should be requested is the audit worksheet. So anytime I receive an email stating that the insured believes the final audit is not accurate, I will request a copy of the audit worksheet from the carrier. So this audit worksheet, it's basically a blueprint of the data the auditor has collected. It shows a breakdown of employee payroll, classification codes, owners, and potential certificates of insurance for vendors and subcontractors. So having the audit worksheet is really helpful and it does a few things for the insured. It's going to help determine what factor is actually driving the additional premium due. So for example, if you believe an officer was potentially included in the final audit when an exclusion form was sent to the carrier, the audit worksheet will allow you to see how the auditor classified the officer as either included or excluded. Another thing is the audit worksheet allows the insured to identify if additional information is needed by the auditor or if it was an auditor error. So for example, an homeowners association receives their final audit and the payroll for their classification has doubled and they're not sure why. So part of the audit worksheet provides a subcontractor summary, and that's going to indicate whether the subcontractor's payroll was included or excluded from the final audit based on if the insured submitted a required certificate of insurance for that vendor. And lastly, the audit worksheet enables the insured to gather the correct documentation required to file a formal audit dispute. So let's continue with our homeowners association example. When the insured goes to file their dispute, they were able to identify what drove the additional premium, and they know that their dispute request is for vendor ABC to be excluded from the final audit, and they're just re-providing that certificate of insurance that may not have been in the first place, or the auditor just missed it on accident. So in the next two slides, I just want to provide some examples of the audit worksheets that I've received from carriers. Each carrier audit worksheet looks a little bit differently, but all of the information you're looking for is going to be there. Payroll, owner exclusions, subcontractors, classifications. It takes some practice to easily decipher and identify a potential error, as it did for me. My advice would be to request the audit worksheets for a final audit if additional premium is due, just so you can get comfortable reviewing the audit worksheet for a potential dispute in the future. So on the left, here's one that I received from AmTrust. So this is like the main page. It has in the top right corner the policy period, the audited period. Down below, it has the two line items, 9066 for homeowners association and another line item for sub homeowners association. That tells me right there that that tells me right there that there was a subcontractor included in the final audit, because the audit worksheet breaks down the difference in employee payroll versus subcontractor payroll. On the right here, this is one from employers. It'll give you the auditor's contact information, the classification, which is 4295 printing. Under the principals section, it actually will tell you that these three officers have all been excluded from the final audit. And the reason for the exclusion is there was an endorsement on file. So that means the insured did provide a signed exclusion form at the time of bind. And then under the audit exposure, it'll show the total gross wages. So you can take a look at this and kind of determine what's driving that additional premium. Here's another couple examples. So on the left, it's the payroll worksheet detail. I have redacted some of the names, but it's basically showing you the payroll that was used for each employee, and that's how the carrier is getting their total for the final audit. And then on the right, the subcontractor summary. So this is what I was mentioning before, where it says 9066 instead of exclude 9066. That indicates that a certificate of insurance was not provided to the carrier, and so their payroll of $4,220 was included in the final audit. We have a quick question. Do we need the insured's permission to request the audit worksheet? Typically, no. You can just go ahead and send a request over to the carrier requesting the audit worksheet, and they should be able to provide it to you, no problem. I do this at least 3 to 4 times a week, and I've never had any issues. So as long as you're directly appointed with the carrier and you're the agent on file, you can go ahead and request a copy of the audit worksheet. So these are super helpful in determining what actually is the reason for the additional premium due. And once you're able to review this, then you'll know the direction and why you are filing the formal audit dispute. So now that you've identified what needs to be disputed, we're going to address what needs to be done to file a formal audit dispute. So audit disputes are only reviewed and accepted by doing the following. So for certain carriers, an audit dispute form must be completed and signed by the insured. For others, a written notice on the insured's letterhead explaining what is being requested to dispute is required. The second item that is necessary to having any revision done, and this is the part that's always forgotten, is providing supporting documentation backing up the reason for your audit dispute. So if your reason for a dispute is subcontractors that were included, then you need to provide a certificate of insurance for that subcontractor. if it's an owner inclusion, then you need to provide the signed exclusion form that you submitted at the time of bind. If it's a payroll discrepancy, then payroll documentation must be resubmitted. So whatever you're disputing, you need to show something to back that up. Otherwise, the auditor is not going to make any changes. So an important part is once the dispute is submitted, the carrier may come back requesting additional information outside of what was already submitted. So for a classification dispute, let's say like, oh, we think that our business should be split commercial 50% payroll in commercial janitorial and 50% in residential commercial janitorial. The carrier may request for additional information on that, and typically it's a list of the employees and their duties. So making sure you're responding back to the request for additional information is really important. I've seen one too many insureds fail to respond to the auditor's request for additional information, and in order to determine if a revision is going to occur, they have to have that. Otherwise, the audit dispute is going to get closed out, and then the process starts all over again if they want to redispute. Some other items to know are filing a dispute is going to put on hold any collection procedures for the premium in dispute. So if the insured had additional premium due and it may have gone to collections, the pursual of payment is going to be put on hold until the dispute is resolved. And once the carrier accepts the insured's request to dispute the audit, it'll result in a revised final audit, and that'll be issued a copy to the insured and a copy to the agent. And lastly, avoiding future audit disputes and efficiently managing the insured's renewal. So essentially, avoiding an audit dispute is going to save time for you and the insured. And by ensuring that all of the documentation is provided and sent to the carrier on time, it can help to potentially avoiding opening up an audit dispute. So some of the easiest ways to avoid an inaccurate audit are ensuring exclusion forms are on file for all officers, certificates of insurance are collected for all hired subcontractors and vendors, payroll adjustments are made during the policy term for employee changes, and understanding the business operations to ensure that the insured is rated properly. Additional practices you can implement to help the insured avoid a large premium due at the time of the audit are collecting a copy of their business plan and budget for those newly established businesses. So are they on track to the payroll that we estimated them at? If not, let's make an adjustment midterm. So that way we can endorse the policy now and help balance out the installment payments. Or if their business is struggling, then let's reduce the payroll on the policy term. For long-standing businesses, continue to obtain copies of their current payroll documents, as the goal is to have the payroll be close to its verified amount at the time of the audit to avoid the highs and lows. So as you're working on the insured's renewal term, do your job in reviewing the payroll documentation and asking the appropriate questions. The importance of reporting accurate information is only helping them to manage their monthly budget. So do your job in reviewing their payroll documentation with the insured and asking the appropriate questions. What should be changed from this year to last year, whether they're hiring or letting staff go, all of that should always be reported. So if the broker's not educating them on how to avoid big premium due, it's going to continue to happen. And that's what the auditor is going to do. So making sure to do it beforehand will help you guys avoid the highs and lows of final audits, and it's going to make the process as seamless as possible.
All right. Thank you, Darby. If anyone has any questions that weren't answered during the webinar, now is the time to chat them in so Darby can answer them before we sign off. And then after we do sign off, I encourage everyone to browse our website. We have tons of tools for you in your office to use, marketing materials, proposal templates, fillable applications, online quoting tools, a ton of recorded webinars on different lines of business and coverages and topics like this. Yeah, so don't hesitate to reach out to Darby after the webinar. Her contact information is on the screen here. And if you have completed applications on file, you can start sending them over to the submissions email you see on screen. So please be sure to stay on so you can complete the survey and help us make these webinars better for you in the future. And I don't see any questions that came in. If anyone has any that they're typing in that we don't get to, just email Darby. And that'll do it for today's webinar. So we appreciate you all joining us, and we look forward to doing business with you. Have a great day.